If you've ever read my blog, or paid any attention to this channel, you've probably noticed I've played a few computer games in my time. I've played some terrible games, some excellent games, and some thoroughly mediocre ones. Occasionally there's a decision that might be big or it might be really small in level design, mechanics, or just plain aesthetics that really sticks out to me as a clever moment. I'd like to start a series to talk about such moments as I find or recall them. To start this off, I'd like to talk about a moment in the Kirby game released for the Wii at the end of 2011. Depending on your region, the game's title is either Kirby's Return to Dreamland, Kirby's Adventure Wii, or Hoshi no Kabi Wii. For simplicity's sake, I'll just be referring to the game from this point on as Kirby Wii. There's a lot I could discuss when it comes to Kirby Wii. At some later stage I might even do a full review. For the moment though, I'll simply say that what the game lacks in innovation, it more than makes up for in quality level design. HAL Laboratory had been making 2D platforms for 19 years by the time this title was finished. With that much experience behind them, their games often demonstrate a subtle understanding of that genre that makes this game a joy to play, even though it's not a particularly difficult one. One of the decisions that has stuck with me over several playthroughs in this game is in Level 1 Stage 2. I'll be referring to that as 1-2 for the rest of this video. For some context, I'll first mention that the stage before it, 1-1, is the game's tutorial level. 1-1 introduces the controls, the power spheres to collect, and even introduces the high-powered upgrade puzzles that lead to hidden boss fights. I could probably make a whole video about how effectively and efficiently this game teaches its rules without artificially halting the action, but for today, I'm just mentioning this level so you understand that 1-2 is essentially when the game really begins. You've been told the rules and have demonstrated you understand them by finishing the level, so now it's time to take off the training wheels and actually get playing Kirby Wii. The first segment is hardly anything special. It's what I would consider a piece of bog-standard level design for a sequel in a long-running platform series. It introduces one of the game's new power-ups, the Leaf, and has some nice verticality thanks to this ladder early on. There's ample health, and there's a small path split so players can make their own route through the enemies en route to the Warp Star. After the Warp Star is where this level really begins to shine for me. First, as you enter this screen, you'll see there's some stars on the left. This subtly teaches players to frequently consider moving the opposite direction that a level would normally go, like say with that signpost pointing to the right. For seasoned veterans of say Mario ROM hacks, this is just best practice in playing a platformer. But Kirby games tend to be aiming for something that children can easily pick up and play. So that the game considers this an important lesson to teach as early as possible shows how much HAL Laboratory care about having really strong level design that encourages people to not just enjoy platformers, but actually get good at them. Once you do decide to move to the right, you can clearly see a cutter ability just sitting there waiting to be picked up. Placing this as a pickup first, rather than inside an enemy like the leaves earlier, is a very clever decision. Newcomers will likely be drawn to it in order to find out what on earth that symbol actually means. Experienced players of Kirby games will know that it's a cutter pickup, and that Kirby games are easy, therefore, it's important that we pick up this cutter because it's probably tied to solving a puzzle, much more so than that leaf in the earlier section. Either way, the cutter is seen as a fixed point that is very important for the player's attention. They need to go pick this up and find out what it's all about. The decision to grab the cutter is justified almost immediately after this, by introducing the spider enemy. These simply drop downwards and can be defeated by any projectile not just hitting their body, but by the web as well. Since the player has just gained the cutter, they're inevitably going to experiment with the move and discover that yes, they can throw the projectiles and cut the ropes. The experimentation is rewarded even further a short while later through introducing platforms tied to ropes. This means that the cutter can not only defeat enemies, but change the nature of the terrain. Positive reinforcement is then also employed, so that cutting a rope will provide access to the 20-star pickup. In order to make sure that the player works this all out, there's also a Sir Kibble placed on one of these platforms that if eaten will provide the copy ability if you happen to lose it in the meantime. After the door, we have the game's first cannon section. While this section isn't part of the level that I really want to talk about in the grand scheme of things, I do like that once again the game communicates ideas without using any text. You're expected to work out the trajectory of the cannon shots, and use this knowledge to work out that you need to jump in order to hit the switch with the cannon shots. You're also expected that you can throw away items by pressing 1 if you want to regain flight so you can hit the energy sphere. Given how few buttons the game has, this isn't a particularly difficult task, but you're still expected to work it out without the game stopping you to tell you what to do. Any break in the action is entirely you refusing to move, rather than the game forcing you to not move. The most notable part of this tower climb is that it provides the needle ability. Much like the cutter earlier, making this a pickup suggests that it's going to help solve a puzzle with some sort of reward. The cutter provided access to 20 stars, so what will the needle lead to? The answer is the needle doesn't actually lead to anything. The energy sphere in this section is just hidden behind some foreground art and can be simply flown to. So it's likely that you're going to keep that needle as you move in through the next door. And upon doing so, you discover that you can throw away the needle and just grab something else entirely. There was a screen like this in 1-1 as well, which was immediately followed by a boss fight. 1-2 further reinforces that this is going to be a recurring theme by naturally introducing a mini-boss fight with the Gigant Edge. One of my favourite parts as a side note about Kirby bosses is how they need to work with not only every ability you may possibly have, but also be satisfying to fight if you happen to lose all power-ups. This tends to lead to the stars you can suck up and spit back at them, doing way more damage than any power-up that you have, but this does mean that if you become proficient at the game, you can definitely drop an ability, suck a star, spit it out, grab your ability, tack on some damage there as well. After Gigant Edge goes down in a climactic explosion, we come to a platform which is tied to a rope. It's a bit of a shame that in this footage we don't have any sort of way to cut this rope, as I elected to take the beam ability. However, using our knowledge from earlier, we do know that the cutter is something that can cut ropes, so maybe we need to go through this level again and get another cutter. Except that the cutter actually doesn't work either. No matter how hard we hit buttons, how well we memorize the ability's move list, we just can't get through the wall to cut the rope. This is why 1-2 has stood out in my memory after several runs. Using the obviously provided cutter previously gave us 20 stars. The needle had no use as well, and that is also pointy, so that would suggest it might be useful against the rope as well. But it's not. In other words, by using positive reinforcement with one ability, the game has fostered an expectation that the next ability will have the same benefits. But in truth, we've been hoodwinked. After exiting the level again, we've now got several options. We can keep banging our head on the puzzle, or we can move on to a different level and tackle this again later. I'm horribly stubborn and headstrong, so I go back through the level, looking again for something else to cut the rope. After finding nothing and resignedly going to fight Gigant Edge again, I remember that he's got a sword. I also remember that 1-1 introduced a sword ability as well. It even had a big powered up sword. Maybe I can suck up the mini-boss. And there we go, I can. So armed with a sword, I return to the rope and discover that it can, in fact, cut through walls. The great thing about the sword is that this isn't the sole source of the ability. The first level provides ample sword pickups, allowing a player to return there if they haven't realized that they can copy a defeated mini-boss. Kirby Wii is not a particularly difficult game. This is actually one of the hardest puzzles in the entire thing. It's memorable in its own right because of the way the level tricks you about the solution earlier on. But in the context of the game as a whole, this is an incredibly smart place to put such a puzzle. In truth, just about every mini-boss in the game provides an ability you need to get an energy sphere. What's important is that having a harder example of this puzzle so early in the game accommodates different playstyles. For people who enjoy ignoring puzzles that give the slightest difficulty, it's so early that there's plenty of other energy spheres they can grab to reach the ending. For players who like to just blaze through on a first run then go back later, the ability to absorb a mini-boss, it will be so ingrained from the rest of the gameplay that when they come back here, they will wonder why they ever had any trouble with this puzzle. And for anyone who decided to stick through to the puzzle until they solved it, this moment will be so memorable for them that they will just be automatically absorbing every mini-boss just in case. I've written before that I consider the enjoyment someone gains from any task is directly tied to how well they can express themselves while doing it. The rope puzzle in Kirby 1-2 always has the same solution. You get the sword and you cut the rope. But there are lots of different ways to actually reach this conclusion. In short, 1-2 has stood out in my memory because it allows for versatility of play while also still finding ways to trick a player very early on into a game. That to me is really strong level design.